Hello, lovely people. Today, while I have my battery out and everything, I'm gonna tell you why you do not need a big three. Now, this topic of big three is kind of very debatable online and everything, and it is kind of clickbaity what I did here with this one. We will be talking about big three. So, first of all, let's define what is a big three. A big three is a wiring upgrade to factory power wires. That means like the main power supply in any car is the alternator, which in my car is over there. The alternator supplies the current into the battery, and from the battery, it gets distributed everywhere else. Now, do you need a big three? To answer very, very quickly, it depends. It depends on what. You need to have a look at the wires that your factory system has and the amperage in the fuse block. So let's have a look. This is the red one, is the main power wire that is coming from the alternator. It goes here and it goes into this fuse block that it gets distributed into starter motor and different fuse panels in the front of the car, on the side, in the back, and everything else. So the main power wire, is this one, and this fuse is for 500 amps, which is 35 square millimeters. So this is a 2-gauge wire. So the 2-gauge wire is the factory, which is the bottom one, That's 35 square mil, 2-gauge wire. What I did, I doubled it up. So potentially I have 70 square mil, which is bigger than the 0-gauge or whatever. Now, this means that 500 amps is the maximum current that this wire can supply. Now, 2-gauge wire, again, depending on the length, because you need to remember that the amperage that the wire can supply depends on the cross section, how big the wire is, but it also depends on the length of the wire. So for example, if this wire and this one is exactly the same, it's both 35 square mil, but this one can support much more current because it's shorter, because the longer wire is going to have more resistance, more voltage drop, more power loss. Now, my specific car, which has a 2-liter diesel engine, has 35 mil 2-gauge from factory. So in reality, I have the same 35 mil running through the firewall and in the back. So in this fuse block, I have a fuse that is 175 amps. So 2-gauge wire, depending again on the length, it can support probably up to 200 amps of continuous current. So it's perfectly fine. If we come back to the big three, what is it? It's upgrade of the wiring. Which wires? So it's potentially 3 wires that being upgraded or doubled up, which is the positive wire that is coming from the alternator to the battery, which is this one. I basically doubled it up. So that's the one, big one. Big two is the ground, because remember, everything that comes in has to come out, and it comes out through the ground. So if you upgrade in the positive wire, you have to upgrade the ground, the negative wire. This is exactly what happens. So one is the factory, and the second one is the additional one. So I do have, again, 2 35 square mil wires going into the ground that is connected through the chassis. Now here you can see, I don't know if you will be able to see, it's a bit dark. Yeah, this black thing, it is a kind of amp meter, current meter for the car itself, so that the car knows how much current is being drawn. This is used for battery management and for BMS and everything. So when you're upgrading, it's mainly, sometimes it's on the positive wire, but most of the time probably it's going to be on the negative one. Make sure you don't bypass it, because if you will bypass it, it might mess up the car electrics. So it has to go through there, and it barely fit. Now, these extra wires that you can see, this is a ground point for something else in the car, and this is a negative for my charger, because I can quick connect a charger. So this is big two in the big three upgrade. First wire, second wire. Now the third wire, which is the most confusing one probably, is the ground that comes from the engine onto your chassis. The alternator has only one wire that's coming out of it, which is the positive one. The ground of the alternator is connected to the engine block itself, and it conducts electricity. So kind of just to help out that we're connecting that extra ground, you can take it directly from the alternator and connect it to somewhere in the chassis like a rail or something, but you have to make sure that it's like a strong piece of metal and not like a flimsy sheet metal or something. And that is the third connection. Now, why do we need this? We know that a lot of cars are old. Some people have very old cars, and old cars were not designed for extra current draw, especially if you have a small engine petrol, like 1 liter, 1.2 liter petrol, it doesn't need that much current. The current that is needed in the car mainly is going to be for the starter motor that rotates the engine. And the bigger the engine, especially the diesels, they need a bigger starter to draw more, and they do draw more current. So it needs to support that. All the extra stuff, the electrical, like the headlights, ABS, like pumps and everything, interior of the car, it doesn't need that much current. And if you see like all of these little fuses that goes into the interior, 100 amps, 100 amps, and 100 amps. So it's not much current. And the smaller the car, the older the car, the smaller the wiring from factory it's gonna have. A lot of times what happens is that on older cars you have oxidation, you have rust and everything in all the connections, like in these fuse blocks and everything. So that again limits the current that you can supply, and it's not the best for the audio because you have voltage drop. Now, coming back to the clickbaity title that you don't need it. It depends on the car and it depends on the system. On newer cars, especially like big engine cars, when you have an SQ type of system where you don't have a lot of amperage draw, you really don't need it. Like in this car, I really don't need it. I just did it because why not? I just had the wire, I had to redo this to run there, so I just did it because I had the wires, I have everything. But in reality, I don't really need it because I will not draw more power than this wire can supply, because this wire can supply 250 amps because it's a bit shorter. So like I'm not going to draw 200 amps for sure. And the main thing is my alternator cannot supply that. So in reality, I don't need it. Do you need it? Check your wires. Check how big your wires are. Check the fuse ratings and everything. Check the connections. If it's in good condition, you don't really need it. Because the thing is, Big 3 is not going to give you any extra power. Big 3, what it does, it kind of stabilizes the voltage so that you wouldn't have excessive voltage drop in case that is caused by poor connections or undersized wiring from the factory. Now, if you have a factory wire from the alternator like this, which is like an 8-gauge wire, probably it would benefit from a Big 3 upgrade, especially if you have like 1,000 watts or like 2,000 watts amplifier in the back. Then yes, because the main thing to do with the Big 3 is to make sure that all the power wires that go into your amplifier can support the current draw that you actually need. If you have a weak link in your power system, that weak link can potentially be fatal. If you have an 8-gauge wire running to your amplifier and you have 3 kilowatts in the back, that wire is going to burn. The connection, again, it needs to be solid. So with Big 3, do you need it? Do you don't need it? It depends. For big, massive bass systems where you have multiple alternators like 300 amp, 350 amp alternator, obviously this single wire is not going to be enough. So if I would have a high output alternator of 300 amps, I would need to double up on the wiring or just remove everything and run a 0-gauge wire to the alternator, then yes. But in my case, I have maybe a 100 amp alternator, 100 amp, 2 of these wires, it's overkill. Even with the battery, if I'm running 100, 150 amps, it's overkill. It's not really needed, but it is what it is. So I hope this was useful for you to decide if you need a big three or not need a big three. Don't go blindly into big three upgrade, because you might potentially not need it. Check your wires, check your fusing, and check how much power you need. So thank you very much for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next one.